The drawing room at Wentbridge had been arranged like a courtroom. Cecily Farwell stood in the doorway and saw it all at once. The long table moved to the center, the chairs positioned in a facing row. The escritoire from the study carried in and set at the head, where Mr. Peel, the solicitor, would preside. The curtains drawn halfway so that the November light came in gray and flat. No fire laid. The room's ordinary warmth was gone, and in its place was something deliberate, something Gerald Harwick had spent 2 years preparing for and had now finally arranged to his own precise specification. Cecily's uncle had been dead for 19 days. She stood with her hands at her sides, dressed in her plainest mourning, the gown she had let out at the sleeves herself in the week after the funeral. She had lived in this house for 2 years and 4 months, since her own father's death had left her without income or household, and she had been useful in this house in the way that women without choices become useful, managing the household accounts her uncle trusted her with, supervising the kitchen and the linen, reading aloud to him in the evenings. When his eyesight failed him, she had not expected to be remembered. Generously, she had expected to be remembered. Florinda Harwick stood near the window, her back to the garden, speaking with a neighbor woman Cecily recognized as Mrs. Penwick. Florinda was dressed magnificently for a will reading, a deep plum gown that the half-light made almost black, her dark hair dressed high and secured with pins Cecily had never seen before this month. At her lapel, pinned with the small gold catch that had never sat at Florinda's collar before last week, was an oval brooch of jet and seed pearl. Cecily's eyes found it before she could stop them, found it, and could not immediately find anything else. The brooch had been her mother's. Her uncle had said so aloud, 3 months before his death, in front of Gerald and Florinda, and the housekeeper who was now standing by the door. He had said, "This was Eliza's, and it belongs to Cecily after me." Not in a letter, not in a document Cecily could produce. In a room full of witnesses, and a specific, quiet morning voice that Gerald had apparently decided no one would repeat. Under sufficient social pressure, the brooch's jet caught the gray window light. The solicitor, Mr. Peel, sat at the table with his papers aligned in front of him with the neatness of a man who manages anxiety through orderliness. Beside him, at the head of the table in his role as the estate's named trustee, sat Lord Alton Cress, the Viscount of Alton, who had been present at Wentbridge for the better part of a month, and whom Cecily had been watching with the careful peripheral attention of someone who cannot afford to be caught looking. He was 36 and had the quality of stillness that came not from coldness but from economy. He did not perform composure. He simply had it, in the way that some people have height or particular colored eyes, as an inherited condition they have never had occasion to question. A sound from the drive pulled Cecily's attention to the window. A fourth carriage, arriving late along the gravel, one she did not recognize. Gerald turned his head. His face did something she had not seen his face do in 2 years of careful victories. It went briefly, still in a way that was not composure, not the polished authority he deployed at every other moment. Something moved behind his eyes, and then was covered over with the speed of a man who has spent decades covering things. Then it returned to its usual expression, and he turned back to Mr. Peel and said something about beginning on time. No one was certain, yet, who was in the fourth carriage. Cecily moved to take her seat along the wall. She had been 21 years old when she arrived at Wentbridge, at her Uncle Henry Harwick's invitation. With 2 trunks and the knowledge that she had nowhere else to go, her father, Mr. Breege, Thomas Farwell, had been a younger son, educated, well-regarded, fond of collecting books he could not always afford, and he had died, leaving a modest sum in a private account that was Cecily's alone, and which she had told no one about, and a great many other debts that required Gerald's management of the estate to settle. Since, by the terms of the entail, the Harwick property passed to the male Harwick line, her uncle had offered her a home and she had accepted it with the clear-eyed gratitude of a young woman who understands the alternative. For the first year, the arrangement had been quietly good. Her uncle was an easy man to be fond of. He read widely and remembered what he read, and he had opinions about Italian gardens, and watercolor technique that were more considered than those of most men she had met, and he was genuinely pleased to have her at the table. The household was well managed under her hand, which was what she gave most freely, and he noticed it without embarrassment, which is a quality rarer in men of property than it ought to be. Then, Gerald had come to stay. He had come 6 months before her uncle's death, with Florinda and 3 trunks, and the announcement that the estate required proper administration during Mr. Harwick's period of decline. Cecily had watched the household reorient around him with the speed of a household that understands which way the wind is now settled. Mrs. Alp, the housekeeper, had remained loyal in the small ways available to a woman in her position. The footman had begun calling Cecily Miss, with a faint apologetic weight that contained more sympathy than any of the Harwick cousins had offered. The gardener, old Haynes, had simply stopped looking at her directly, which was its own kind of message. It was Florinda who had introduced the phrase that the household subsequently adopted. Cecily had been passing the morning room doorway 3 days before this reading, carrying a stack of household accounts her uncle had asked her to review before he could no longer ask for anything, when she heard Florinda's voice through the half-opened door. Florinda was speaking with Mrs. Penwick, who had come to call, and the conversation had the quality of a conversation that has been waiting to happen. What Cecily heard was this: "You must not expect anything on her behalf. She is a dependent and nothing more. Henry always had a soft heart for strays, but Gerald has the situation well in hand." A pause, and then Mrs. Penwick's murmured agreement, the particular sound of a woman confirming a view she had already held privately. Then the careful resumed conversation of women who had said what they meant to say. Cecily had continued down the corridor with her stack of household accounts, and had not altered her step. She had put those same accounts in order, that same afternoon, along with the estate's tenant ledger. She had reviewed the tenant ledger because she could, and because she was methodical, and because it gave her something to do with her hands during the hours when the weight of the house pressed most heavily. She had found that the winter quarter's rent had not been paid to 7 of the 12 tenant households. Gerald had told the steward that the estate was being re-evaluated, and the tenants should wait through the new year. She had looked at the column of names. She had thought of the families she knew who held those cottages, the Brents with their 3 children, the Wades with the old grandfather who could not manage on his own, the cook widow who kept her accounts in a biscuit tin and brought Cecily a jar of summer preserves each August without fail. She had taken the ledger to her room and spent a long evening with her pen and her own modest account figures, and by the following morning she had arranged payment to all 7. She had told no one. It was not a gesture she expected anyone to see. It was simply the thing she was able to do, and the right thing to do, and she was her father's daughter. In enough ways to understand that these 2 categories were, when they aligned, a kind of instruction. If you are still here with Cecily in that corridor, still watching the brooch on another woman's lapel, stay close. What is about to enter this room will take some time to arrive, but it will arrive. There was a cold wind through the door when it opened again, and then a voice. Not the solicitor's, not Gerald's, not anyone's. Cecily could immediately place. "I believe I am expected," the voice said. "Though I imagine some of you hoped I was not." The woman who entered the drawing room was perhaps 58 years old, and she moved as though rooms had been clearing for her for decades, regardless of whether anyone intended them to. She was plain in her dress, a traveling coat of dark wool somewhat road-dusty at the hem, no ornamentation beyond a plain linen collar. She carried a leather document satchel held against her side with the specific care of someone transporting something that matters. Her hair was iron gray and pinned, with no ceremony whatsoever, as though hairpins were a practical matter, and she had no patience for them to be otherwise. Her eyes were a clear, unsentimental brown that appeared to have been cataloging the room since the door began to open. She stopped at the edge of the assembled party and looked at Gerald steadily. "Miss Dorothea Farwell," she said. "Or rather, Mrs. Dorothea Latimer, as I have been for 31 years. Though your family found it convenient to forget the Farwell half of that, I am Henry Harwick's eldest sister, I believe we have a will to read." The room did not move. Gerald's face had the expression of a man who has been handed an object he did not order and cannot immediately return. He recovered quickly because he was a man who had always recovered quickly, and he said, "My aunt is not expected at this proceeding," in a voice calibrated to suggest that this was a procedural matter rather than a personal one. "She and my uncle had no correspondence of which I am aware for a great many years." "You are not the custodian of your uncle's correspondence," Mrs. Latimer said, and moved past him. Mr. Peel had risen from his chair the moment she spoke. His hand went to a correspondence folder on the table beside him, and Cecily could see him rifling through it, his face moving through something between recognition and confusion, and then settling into a professional stillness that meant he was processing. He produced a letter. He held it up slightly, as though he could not quite believe the evidence of his own filing system, and said, "Mrs. Latimer, I had a letter from a London address. I confess I was not certain whether to expect you." "Whether to expect me at all," she said. "Quite. I have found it useful to allow uncertainty about my intentions. Please sit down, Mr. Peel. I mean to observe. We can discuss documents in a moment." She took the empty chair at the end of the row without being invited to do so, set her satchel on her knees, and folded her hands over it with the patience of a woman who has been patient for 31 years and is now entirely finished with it. Cecily looked at the woman. This aunt she had never met, this person whose name her uncle had mentioned only twice in her hearing, and both times with a particular quality of careful neutrality that she now recognized as grief. She had not known that she had family still living. She had not known this woman existed in any present tense sense. The knowledge settled in her chest with the specific weight of things that rearranged the room when they arrived. Lord Alton was watching the room. He had been watching it since Mrs. Latimer entered. He had a way of attending to a scene that was different from Gerald's surveillance, different from Mrs. Penwick's avid social attention. He was watching the way a man watches a problem he has almost solved, when a new element enters that confirms the hypothesis he had not yet allowed himself to hold. He had spent the previous afternoon walking the estate's outer holdings to audit the tenant situation before the reading. He had intended it as a routine survey. The tenant Brent, a composed man of middle years who farmed the eastern parcel and kept his land in better order than most, had answered his questions about the condition of the hedgerows and the state of the autumn drainage, and then had added with no particular emphasis, as a thing he assumed was already known, that he was grateful for the winter quarter's payment having arrived. Early, he had assumed Lord Alton had arranged it. He had seemed mildly surprised to learn otherwise. Lord Alton had returned to the house and examined the estate ledger Gerald had provided him. The ledger showed tenant debts outstanding. The tenant Brent had thanked him for a payment the ledger did not record. Either Brent was confused, or the ledger was false, or someone had made a payment. Gerald had not entered. He had carried the discrepancy into this morning. Turning it in his mind, Gerald cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" he said, making it not a question. "Given that we have been waiting long enough, my aunt's arrival aside, there is a legal proceeding to attend to." He glanced at Cecily, with the casual dismissal of someone confirming a detail already settled. "Whatever claims are made here, they change nothing. She is a dependent and nothing more, Miss Farwell, that is. She has no standing at this table. The word landed." Lord Alton looked at Cecily. She had not moved. Her hands were in her lap, precisely folded. Her face was the face she had learned to keep in this room, a specific, studied composure that cost her something each time she assembled it, and that she had been assembling for 19 days. She felt Lord Alton's attention and did not return it. She was not certain she trusted herself to. Mr. Peel began. He read the will that Gerald had produced for his inspection 4 days after her uncle's death. It was 6 pages long and written in the formal language that such documents require, and it disposed of the Wentbridge estate and its associated holdings to Gerald as primary heir, with various smaller bequests to household staff and charitable purposes. Cecily's name did not appear in the first 4 pages. When it appeared at last, it was in a paragraph that provided for her a sum of £150 and the use of the east bedroom through the current year. £150. She had known. Gerald had told her himself. 2 weeks ago, in a private conversation he had evidently planned with some care, that her uncle had left her a modest provision and that she should begin to consider her options with regard to future accommodation. He had said it gently. That was the manner he adopted for certain things, the manner of a man who believes that the delivery of bad news with sufficient softness transforms the nature of the news itself. She had spent those 2 weeks considering. She had paid the tenant rents and set the household accounts in order and written out a careful list of situations a woman, with some education and a modest private sum and no remaining family, might apply for. Companion? Governess? Lady's assistant to some household that needed a woman with a head for figures and an ability to manage staff without creating enemies. She had held each possibility in her mind with the same practical assessment she had brought to everything in the past 2 years, because the alternative to practical assessment was grief, and grief would have to wait for a moment when she could afford it. The solicitor finished reading. He set down the pages and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has completed his function. Gerald's posture settled fractionally, the barely perceptible easing of a man who has been holding a position for a long time and has now been told he may stand down. Florinda's fingers moved to the jet brooch and touched it once briefly. The gesture of a woman confirming a possession she intends to keep. Mrs. Penrick, seated 2 chairs from Cecily, leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and said, in the particular stage murmur of a woman who has been waiting for her occasion, "Well, it is as we all supposed, a dependent and nothing more." The room was quiet. Cecily set her hands flat on her knees and looked at the middle distance, and breathed once carefully. The gray window light had not changed. The fire was still unlit. Mrs. Penwick's murmur settled into the room's furnishings like smoke, and stayed there £150, and the east bedroom through the year. She had known. She had told herself, for 19 days, that she had known and was prepared, and she understood now, in the way one understands things, that the body grasps before the mind admits them, that knowing a thing in the abstract and receiving it in a room full of people who had decided her worth some weeks before, she had nothing to gain by remaining here. She had said her goodbyes to this house in her mind each night, for 2 weeks, and knew precisely which ones she meant. The kitchen garden, put to bed for winter in the rows her uncle had planted. The window at the end of the east corridor, where the afternoon light came at an angle, she had not found anywhere else. The shelf in the library where his books sat, in the order she had helped him restore after Gerald had his men move them, to make room for an escritoire that no one used. She thought of the tenant cook, the widow in the 3rd cottage, who had brought her preserves each August without fail, who would need to know who her landlord was now, and whether to be afraid. She was not certain she could remain in her chair 1 moment longer. Miss Farwell. The voice was level and unhurried and entirely without drama, and it stopped Cecily as completely as if she had walked into a wall. Mrs. Tella. Latimer set both hands on the satchel's clasp and looked at Cecily with the brown eyes that had been cataloguing this room since the door opened. "Sit down," she said. "We are not finished." She opened the satchel. The document she produced was folded twice and sealed with a ribbon, and it was accompanied by a second document, smaller, which she set on the table alongside it with the deliberateness of a woman who has rehearsed this moment many times and knows exactly in which order the pieces are meant to fall. She addressed herself to Mr. Peel with the manner of a woman who has managed her own affairs without assistance for 3 decades and sees no reason to modulate that competence now. "This is the will my brother Henry signed in my presence in February of this year," she said. "It was witnessed by Mr. Cumma, George Alsthorpe of Lincoln's Inn, and by the Reverend Michael Crane of St. Clement's Parish, whose addresses I have here. It was subsequently entrusted to my keeping on my brother's express instruction, confirmed in a letter of which I have a copy." She set the smaller document beside the larger. That letter also identifies the codicil your client has produced today as a later revision. My brother dates it to September. I have written evidence, also present, that Henry was unable to hold a pen without assistance from the 3rd week of August until his death. He did not write anything in September. He did not sign anything in September without another hand guiding his. The room had a quality of air. Now that it had not had before, something had changed in the way the light moved through it. Gerald said, "This is preposterous," and his voice had the note of a man who has just discovered that the ground he stands on is not what he believed. "It may well be," Mrs. Latimer said without inflection. "Mr. Cation." Peel may examine both documents and form his own view. Mr. Peel was already reaching for the papers with the focused expression of a solicitor who has just understood that he has been used without his knowledge and is quietly, professionally furious about it. He spread the documents on the table and bent over them in a silence that the room held carefully, as though any sound might disturb something delicate and important. Mrs. Latimer continued, and her voice did not rise. Not once, not even slightly. It had the quality of a long patience finally given its occasion. The substituted codicil was prepared, I believe, with the assistance of a clerk in the Harwick family's former solicitor's office, who has since removed himself to Bristol. I have his address as well, should it become necessary. The witnesses named on the codicil produced this morning are, to my knowledge, Mr. Gerald Harwick's own cousin and his wife's brother. I leave that to the proper authorities to examine in due course. She folded her hands again and looked at Gerald with the flat, complete attention of a woman who has known someone since his birth and has therefore no remaining illusions about him. I am not angry with you, Gerald. I have had 30 years to understand that you are, at your core, a man who believes that wanting a thing entitles you to it. I find it merely sad that Henry's death was the occasion you chose to act on that belief. Gerald stood. He said several things, in a rising order of desperation, each of which located a different ground of objection and found it equally unable to support his weight. He said the documents could not be verified on such short notice. He said his aunt had always been an erratic woman. He said there were legal processes for challenges of this nature, and that this was not the appropriate venue, and that Mr. Gisk Peel should not be touching those papers until proper counsel had reviewed the situation. Mr. Peel was reviewing the situation. Lord Alton rose from his chair. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Mr. Cram. Peel, who was now examining the documents with the thorough attention of a professional man who has found something that confirms a discomfort he had been carrying for weeks. Then he looked at Cecily, who had not sat back down, who was standing at the edge of her chair with the stillness of a woman who has been preparing for 19 days to receive a verdict and has just been handed a document she does not yet know how to hold. Miss Farwell is named, he said. That is the only document I recognize. 12 words. Level. Complete. Mr. Peel looked up and said, yes, he believed that was correct. Gerald said again that it was preposterous, and the word had lost whatever force it had carried the first time. The room's attention had released him. It moved to Mrs. Missett. Latimer, who had already set the correspondence folder open on the table and was explaining to Mr. Peel in methodical order each piece of corroborating evidence she had assembled in London over the previous 3 weeks. The handwriting analysis she had commissioned from a reputable examiner. The testimony set down in writing of the Reverend Crane regarding the February signing. The letter from her brother in his own hand, while his hand could still be trusted, setting out his intentions with the clarity of a man who had not entirely trusted the people around him, but had loved them nonetheless. Florinda had not moved. Her hand was at the brooch, at the jet and seed pearl oval that caught whatever light entered this room. Mrs. Latimer, in the middle of her explanation to Mr. Datamay. Peel turned her head and looked at Florinda's lapel for a long, considering moment. She did not say anything immediately. She allowed the silence to exist between them. Then, conversationally, as though identifying an object she recognized from a prior visit, she said, "That brooch was my brother's specific bequest to his niece. I was present in this house when he said so." Florinda's fingers stilled against the jet. Mrs. Alp, standing by the door throughout all of this, made a sound that was barely a sound, less than a breath, more than nothing. Florinda looked at Cecily. Cecily did not look away. She was not triumphant. She was simply present, and still in the manner she had been practicing for 19 days. She had learned this stillness from her uncle, who had practiced it for 20 years, under Gerald's particular method of management, and she had not understood until this moment that it was not resignation he had been teaching her. It was endurance in the specific sense of remaining upright long enough for the truth to catch up. Florinda unclipped the brooch. She set it on the table beside the document satchel without a word. The sound it made against the table was very small. No one watched her do it except Cecily, who watched it the way one watches something returned from a long distance. The following hour was the province of Mr. Ta, Peel and Lord Alton, and the careful, methodical machinery of legal recourse. Placed. Gerald and his wife were asked to withdraw to the study, which they did. Florinda first, Gerald last, with the diminished tread of a man who has stepped on what he believed was solid ground and found it paper all the way through. Penrick excused herself shortly afterward, with the speed of a woman who understands that witnessing an exposure is not the same as complicity in it, and wishes to establish that distinction as quickly as possible. The footman opened the study door and closed it again, and the house settled into a different quality of silence, one in which a thing long held in suspension had at last been resolved. Lord Alton came to stand beside Cecily, while Mr. Peel organized his correspondence. He did not approach her with the careful enthusiasm of a man announcing her liberation. He came to stand beside her in the way he moved about this house, with the unhurried economy of a man who knows where he is going and sees no reason to perform the journey. He said, "I spoke with your tenant Brent yesterday afternoon. He thanked me for the winter rent payment. I had not made any payment." Cecily looked at him. It needed to be paid. Gerald had informed me the matter was under administrative review. Gerald informs people of things that serve him. The Brents have 3 children and a cold winter ahead of them, and the Cook widow manages on very little. She said it without apology, because she felt none. I had the means and the ledger. It seemed the correct use of both. He was quiet for a moment. His attention was on her in a way that was distinct from how he looked at the estate ledger or the document on the table. A kind of focused, personal regard that she had been careful not to name for a month. "My sister," he said, "was left £300 by my father. A codicil, signed 2 months after his death, reduced it to 40. I was 29. I was presented with the codicil by my uncle and I accepted it because the paper appeared to be in order, and I did not think to examine the date alongside the quality of the handwriting." He said it in the same voice he used for most things, level, unhurried. She understood that it cost him a great deal to say it in any voice at all. He was a man who did not volunteer his errors as a rule. That he had offered this one, standing in a room where the table had so recently held one substituted document and one true one, told her something she filed alongside the attention she had already stopped pretending not to notice. "I have been looking at dates and handwriting very carefully for 7 years. I am sorry it took Mrs. Latimer's arrival to name what I could not name myself." "Did your sister receive her portion eventually?" Cecily asked. "She did. It required considerable effort and considerable time. She is well now and has, with some grace I have not entirely managed to replicate, stopped thinking about it." He looked at the table where Mrs. Latimer and Mr. Peel were still conferring, the document spread between them like a map of restored territory. "I do not have her gift for setting things down. You recognized the truth when it was placed in front of you," Cecily said. "That is not a small thing. Not everyone does." He looked at her, then with the quality of attention she had been not naming for a month, and she did not look away from it, because she was a practical woman, and there is a point at which the evidence ceases to be ambiguous. Mrs. Latimer remained in the drawing-room long after the others had dispersed, sitting with the retrieved brooch in the chair she had taken by the door. Cecily came and sat beside her. The afternoon had moved around to its later hour. and the gray light through the window had the quality of November in its settled face, the long, honest dark beginning its approach. "You were in London," Cecily said. "All this time?" 11 years, since my husband died. Before that, Edinburgh." She turned the brooch over in her fingers, the jet warm from her hand. "Henry and I began corresponding again, very quietly, perhaps 12 years ago. Gerald was never told. He asked you to keep the will. He wrote to me in January. He said he was not certain the proper document would survive the reading if someone with motivation had access to the household papers." She looked at the door through which Gerald had retreated. "He knew his nephew very well. He knew everyone very well," Cecily said. "He simply could not always bring himself to say so." "The Farwell disposition?" said Mrs. Satterey. Latimer, with a dryness that was the first humor Cecily had heard in 19 days, and the first glimpse of what it had cost this woman to be a Farwell in a household that had stopped saying her name. "We observe accurately and speak late. I am told we are working on the second half." Cecily closed her fingers around the brooch. She did not allow herself to weep until she reached her room. She sat at the edge of her bed with the brooch in her palm and the afternoon going dark outside the window, and she wept for her uncle who had been a good and careful man in a position that required him to be careful around people who would have used goodness against him. She wept for the tenant rents that should never have been withheld. She wept for the aunt who had been a name mentioned twice in 3 years, and was now sitting downstairs in the drawing room, reading Henry's correspondence by the window, because she had been a sister before she was in exile and had not forgotten how. The house needed 3 weeks to settle into its new arrangement. The proper authorities required correspondence, and Mr. Tron Peel required documentation, and Gerald and his wife removed themselves to their own establishment in Sussex. With the subdued speed of people who have understood the precise dimensions of their situation and prefer not to have those dimensions examined in proximity to the scene. Mrs. Penwick was seen at various morning calls in the weeks that followed, reframing her prior opinion of the outcome with the fluid confidence of a woman for whom community opinion has always been whatever the correct people are currently holding. She sent a very handsome card at Christmas. Dorothea Latimer stayed on through the winter. She said she had nowhere urgently to be, which was true, and that the house needed a second sensible woman, which was also true. And Cecily suspected this was her aunt's method of saying that she had been absent from her family's house for 30 years and was not prepared to leave it again the moment things became orderly. Cecily did not press her to clarify. She was her father's daughter, and understood that some things are stated by their presence rather than their articulation. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the season. The rose her uncle had planted covered against the cold, and Cecily planned the spring's arrangement in the evenings by the fire with Mrs. Alp's garden journal, which Mrs. Alp produced without being asked, with the manner of a woman restoring something to its rightful location. Lord Alton came to call in the first week of December, which was the appropriate interval. He came formally with his card presented at the door and his hat removed in the hall and the correct brief note sent around the day prior. Mrs. Alp answered the door with an expression of professional satisfaction that was the closest her face ordinarily came to warmth. Dorothea was in the sitting room and looked up when he was announced, assessed him in the way she assessed everything, and returned to her pen without comment, though the corner of her mouth moved fractionally in a direction that was not exactly disapproval. He had brought the deed confirmation from the solicitor's office, which was efficient. He had also brought a small volume of Italian verse that had been among the estate papers, with Cecily's name written on the inside cover in her uncle's handwriting, the same careful script she had spent 2 years finding in the margins of household accounts, the handwriting of a man who was kind, without wanting anyone to make a ceremony of it. She held the book for a moment and could not immediately speak. "I found it in the library boxes when the inventory was completed," Lord Alton said. "It seemed clear that it had been set aside deliberately." "He knew I read Italian," Cecily said. "Not well. Well enough." "I read a few of them myself," he said, and there was in his voice something that might have been the beginning of something almost like amusement, arrived at very late and very carefully, a thing that had needed a great deal of context to feel safe. She thanked him. She asked whether he would take tea. He said he would. They sat in the drawing room, where the long table had been returned to its ordinary position against the wall, and the fire was properly laid and the curtains stood fully open to the gray December light, and they talked about the estate's tenants and the deed's specific terms and Brent's new drainage plan for the eastern parcel, and a very small amount about the Italian verse, which Alton had evidently sampled with some care, and found worth the effort. Dorothea came through once on an invented errand, and left again without remarking on anything which was its own kind of remark. When he rose to go, in the correct interval, Cecily walked with him to the hall. He took his hat from Mrs. Alp. He settled it with the particular economy of a man who does not perform small actions, who simply performs them. He was looking at Cecily with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize and had stopped making herself look away from, because the evidence had long ceased to be ambiguous, and she was, as she had told herself since the first week of his presence here, a practical woman. On the hall table, where she had placed it that morning, the jet brooch caught the December light through the tall window and held it in the seed pearls along the oval's edge, a small fixed point of warmth in the gray afternoon. She reached for it and pinned it at her collar where it had always been intended to sit, and felt the slight familiar weight of it settle against her morning gown for the first time since her uncle's death. Something eased in her chest that had not been easy for 19 days, or longer. She looked up. He said, "Cecily," quietly. In the same unhurried voice he said, "Everything," and then said nothing else, because nothing else was necessary. The hall was still outside. The first real cold of winter had arrived without drama, as it always did, as though it had simply been waiting for everyone to be ready. The bare elms at the front of the drive stood gray against the pale sky. Somewhere in the house behind her, a fire was laid, and her aunt was in the sitting room writing a letter, and Mrs. Alp was overseeing the kitchen in the particular way Mrs. Alp had always overseen it, with the confidence of a woman whose household had been briefly borrowed and was now firmly restored. The brooch was at her collar. The deed with her name on it sat in the escritoire in the study. The tenant cook would not need to be afraid. She was home. Thank you for remaining until the end. If Cecily's patience and her aunt's long journey home have stayed with you in the way I hope they have, I would be glad to know it. The brooch sat at Cecily's collar all winter, and in the spring she wore it to the church in the village where her uncle had worshipped, and then she came home to Wentbridge, and Dorothea was there, and the Italian verse was on the table in the drawing room, and the kitchen garden was putting out its earliest green along the rows her uncle had planted. And everything that had been taken and then restored had the specific weight of things that are more fully possessed for having once been absent.